You know, that night wasn't a cold night as I remember it, but I do remember having this cold chill go down my spine as we waited for my dad to get back from the meeting. And we were all gathered around the fire pit that's in front of our house here, and we would sit around and wonder, talking, what might be happening at the meeting. I was there with my two brothers. My brother Jake, 17, he thinks he's hot stuff. He's getting married next month, and he always likes to be in charge. And then there's my younger brother, Josiah. He's 12. He's just annoying. Except this week, he was mostly scared. And the truth is, most of us were pretty scared that week as we wondered what would happen next, because here in Egypt, things are pretty freaky the last few months. I mean, all kinds of stuff has been hitting us that we've never seen before. There's frogs coming out of nowhere, and boils, and gnats, and hailstones, and the river turning to blood. I mean, it had been some freaky times, and it didn't surprise me that Josiah was scared. My dad was one of the clan leaders, and so he would go to the meetings where they would find out everything that was going to happen next and then come and tell us, and we sat and waited because there had been 9 plagues so far, and we thought this next one might be the big one. Dad would always reassure us that our God, Yahweh, was up to something, that he was going to be rescuing us, and that these plagues were a part of a bigger plan. We mostly just experienced the pain that came as a result from them, and that there was no food, and things were getting tighter and harder as the times went by. So we waited for my dad to get back. We knew that some of the things that he said had to be right. I mean, there was this subplot. It wasn't just we were experiencing pain. There were gods, like a battle of the gods was happening. It was Yahweh against everyone else. That first plague, when the river turned red, it was like Yahweh was going directly against Hapi, the fertility god, who's supposed to keep the waters of the Nile clean. And then there was Hecht, who he went against, who oftentimes, he's the god of the resurrection, oftentimes appears as a frog, and so the frogs were against him. And then there's Seth, the god who's supposed to protect all of the crops. Well, when the hailstones wrecked the crops, and then the locusts came and ate the rest of it, that was the end of worshiping Seth. Nobody believed he could protect the crops anymore. But this last one, this 9th plague, the plague of darkness, that was directly against the god Ra, the sun god. It was so dark we couldn't tell when was night and when was day. And everybody knew that if Yahweh could blot out the sun, well, he could do anything. Ra was the sun god and the father of Pharaoh. And so this was getting straight at Pharaoh, and word on the street was that the 10th plague was going to be directly after the heart of Pharaoh, but none of us knew what it was going to be. My dad came back from the meeting that night, and he told us, we couldn't believe what he said. He said, every firstborn in Egypt is going to die. Animals, people, the rich, the poor, even Pharaoh's son was going to die. And we knew that this was the fastest way to get after the heart of Pharaoh. Pharaoh loved his son. His legacy was in his son. And that this plague would strike not only at his hopes for the future, at his deepest love, but even at his very divinity. But my first thought was, what about Jake? I mean, he may not be the dream for an older brother, but he's my older brother. If every firstborn is going to die, what about him? And then Dad told us, well, God's got a different plan for us. And can I tell you something? It was weird, the plan that he told us. But everything in Egypt was weird these days. And so we decided, if Yahweh's that powerful and he gives us the plan, we're going to follow it. In detail, this is what my dad said went down between Moses and Pharaoh. It's recorded in Exodus chapter 11, beginning at verse 4. And this is what it says. So Moses said, "This is what Yahweh says. About midnight, I'll go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the female slave who's at her handmill, and all the firstborn cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there ever has been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that Yahweh makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, 'Go, you and all the people who follow you.' And after that, I will leave." Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh. Can you imagine what it would be like to be Israel in those days? To be a slave, to be in the midst of the intensity of all of the plagues striking plague after plague after plague, and then to hear this very last plague of the firstborn. Now, they shouldn't be terribly surprised because God predicted this all the way back in Exodus chapter 5. He said, "Pharaoh, since my son is Israel, and you've been abusing and offending and killing my son for generations, well, I'm going to take your son from you as well." And God predicted that this would happen, and everything that God predicts does happen. Hundreds of predictions there are in the Bible, and every single one of those predictions comes true. It's a consistent point. You know, people in our culture make predictions too. There are some people, in fact, who are famous for making predictions. Weather people, for one, right? We heard some predictions earlier this week. The storm of the century will hit New York City. They were only off by about 1,000 miles, right? It's right here in Omaha, Nebraska right now. And, weather people aren't always right, but I heard a speaker earlier this week say that not only are weather people not always right, he was a banker, and he was talking about economists. Many of you know I was an econ major at the University of Illinois, and he said, "I think God made economists for a reason, and the reason he made economists is to make weather people look good." Because, in defense of economists have predicted 10 out of the last 5 recessions. Well, God makes a prediction, and better than weather people, better than economists, he gets it right every single time. He says, "I will do X," and then he goes ahead and does it. He says, "I'm going to kill every firstborn son," and so from Pharaoh's kid all the way to the female slave's kid, everyone is going to be killed at midnight. But interestingly, there's this passage that says, "Not a dog will bark in Israel." Did you notice that? Did that seem a little bit odd to you? Not a dog will bark. You may wonder what that's about. Well, in ancient Egypt, dogs were not family pets. Dogs were mangy curs that roamed the streets and barked at everything. I don't know if you've ever been in a culture where dogs are not pets, but they're street roamers. I was when I was in the Philippines. When I was 19 years old, spent a summer there. And from the jeepney stop to the multiple blocks that it took to walk to our house, there were about a dozen different dogs that would come out, snarl their teeth, and bark at us. And I'll never forget my partner, Keith, said, "You want me to show you how to take care of those dogs?" I'm like, "Yeah, go ahead." And he literally bared his teeth, snarled, got down and said, "You get out of here." And they did. It was amazing. So they go off. But those dogs would bark all day and all night. And what the passage is saying is there will be weeping and moaning in Egypt like has never been heard before and will never be heard again. But among the Israelites, there will be a calm that is so unusual that not even the dogs will be barking. And God says, by doing this, I will draw a divider between Egypt and Israel, and you will know that I, the God of the Israelites, am the one true God, that I am Yahweh. Now, some may take a look at this, the death of all of these people happening on the same day, and ask questions about God. Is God cruel? Is this unjust? Does God have the right to do such a thing? And in order to understand this, I think we need to keep in perspective that death is normative. Death comes to everybody. Everybody dies at one point or another, and there will be different ages that people die. People have different numbers of days in this world. There's different ways that people die. Some will die of disease or of plague or of heart failure or of wars or of murder. There's all different ways that people will die, but everybody dies. And it could certainly be argued that God, the sovereign God of the universe, has control over when every single person dies. Whether it's young or old, it's just God's right to make these kinds of decisions. So in Egypt that day, he made the decision that firstborn will die, which is certainly God's right. And in this case, not only is it God's prerogative, but God is able to use that to shape and change world history, to create a rescue story for a people that will last for thousands of years and will be the setup for a rescue story that will reach billions of people across the world. And God said, for this purpose, it's worth it for me, and he has the right to be able to do that kind of a thing. But death is something that's not just typical for people in Egypt. Death is typical for people all over the world all the time. Last time I checked, death rate was still hovering somewhere around 100%. God can choose the day that we die, or he can choose to protect us from death. And oftentimes, God chooses protection, and for that, we're thankful. But today, in this world, 153,000 people will die. And if you consider all of the people who consider Christ Community Church their home, before 2015 is over, we'll likely experience 40 deaths just in our church family. Because that's the way life works. And sometime during your lifetime, you have to reconcile this idea of death. What's going to protect me from death? Not just physical death, because everyone's going to die eventually, but eternal death. Because our eternal death is just as certain unless we get rescued. Unless there's someone who comes in who's capable of saving us from the death that we've all earned, that I've earned, by our separation from the one true God. So God is doing this amazing act. But quite strangely, before he gets to that, he goes on this long tangent about the dinner that they're supposed to eat before this major event happens. And he goes into excruciating detail about what that dinner is to be like. And the reason is that God knows that this moment will be instituted as a festival and a memory for a long time coming. So he wants to make sure they get the details right in the first place. And that's what he begins to teach them in chapter 12, beginning at verse 1. It says this: Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. And if any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat, and the animals you choose must be 1-year-old males without defect. And you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight." Now, an interesting side note on this one is that this is going to be their first month of the year. And in the lunar calendar, the month always begins with the new moon, which means the 14th day would be the full moon when it would be taking place. And they were to do their slaughter on the evening of at twilight of the 14th day of the full moon, and they're most likely to be able to see what they're doing at that evening moment. And this becomes a part of their regular rhythm. In fact, this becomes their New Year's celebration. It becomes their Passover meal celebration. And in fact, it's the way that we use today to date Good Friday and Easter celebrations as well. That's why it's kind of a floating holiday that happens every single year. But during that time, they're to take a 1-year-old lamb that has no defects in it. So you don't take a lame animal. You don't take one that is about to die anyway. You take a good one at a prime time in their life, 1 year old, and you say, "We're going to sacrifice this one." And then he tells them what to do with it. Next verse. Then they're to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they're to eat the meat roasted over the fire along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it until morning. If some of it is left till morning, you must burn it. And this is how you are to eat: with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is Yahweh's Passover. Now, there's huge symbolism that's taking place in this event. Every single piece means something. So the bitter herbs that they're eating are to remind them of the bitterness of the slavery that they're a part of. The bread without yeast reminds them that the meal was prepared in haste, without time for the bread to rise, and with bread that the next day will be easier to be able to pack with them. They're ready for God to act in a moment and for the people to respond. The meat was to be roasted over the fire. And not only was that the fastest way to prepare the food, but it reminded them of the lamb who spilled the blood that was put on the doorposts as well. Even their posture is to be rushed. Shoes on, coat on, tucked into your belt, ready to go, staff in hand. God is doing something amazing, and you don't want to miss it because you're having a lazy, slow-moving meal. This is to be called Yahweh's Passover. Now, that word Passover is a little bit hard to translate. We say Passover, and that is a valid meaning of that word, but there's also another subtlety that when you read how this word is used in other Old Testament passages, it has a bigger subtlety to that. Now, the word that we're using is our big deal word of the week. The word is Pesach. Pesach. It's not a big word, so I made it a big deal word of the week. Everybody say Pesach. Okay, I want to hear that guttural sound come out of the back of your throat. Pesach. Yeah, don't loogie on the person next to you, especially those of you who are at home there. Pesach. And Pesach has this subtle meaning of not only passing over, but also of protection. So God is passing over and he's protecting the people all at the same time. And this festival is to be Yahweh's Pesach. Now, the blood of the lamb would be a symbol that would mark the doorframes of the people. And this is how it would be told the difference between the people of Israel and the people of Egypt, because the Egyptians would not have any blood of the lamb that would be on their doorframes. But the people of Egypt, or the people of Israel, certainly would. Now, throughout the writings of Moses, throughout the Pentateuch, you'll find this idea of blood being sprinkled in places. It's sprinkled on the altar, it's sprinkled in the tabernacle, blood is sprinkled on the Ark of the Covenant, and the reason, sometimes even sprinkled on the people. And the reason that the blood is sprinkled in all of these different places is for cleansing. We'll see in English the word atonement being used, but a really good translation of that word is the idea of cleansing. And so the premise behind that is that we sprinkle the tabernacle with blood because how could a holy God, Yahweh, take up residence with his people unless there's a clean place for him to be? Because a holy God can't live among a sinful people without a cleansing that takes place. And so blood was sprinkled in the tabernacle for cleansing. Blood was sprinkled on the altar for cleansing. Blood was sprinkled on the people for cleansing. Blood was sprinkled even on the Ark of the Covenant for cleansing that would take place. And so on that day, they marked their doors and they said, this is a place that's cleansed for Yahweh to be able to take up residence. He can have residence in my house because of this blood that's been sprinkled on the doorways. The blood of an innocent lamb that was given up so that we might have protection and the Passover. And so they did that using hyssop. Now, hyssop was an ancient cleansing agent as well. It was used to be able to bleach clothing and some other things along that line. So there's kind of a double cleansing element that's available right here. And if you skip down to verses 12 to 23, you'll see a little bit about what it says. It says, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the door frame. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and the sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway. And he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses or strike you down. Now notice in this passage in verse 23 that there are two agents that are going throughout Egypt at the time. There's Yahweh himself who's present and coming out, but there's also this person that's called the destroyer. And God's angle on this is whenever he sees a door frame that's filled with blood, he will not allow the destroyer to enter into that house. It's Pesach. It's protection of the Lord for the people who are in this household. It's a powerful picture of what God's doing in our midst. Yahweh is the protector. And I hope you're starting to see the symbolism that's here. Because this was not just an isolated event that happened in ancient Egypt with the ancient Israelites. This is a foreshadowing of God's big story in the universe. That there was going to come a time when God would visit the planet. And when John the Baptist very first saw Jesus come on the scene, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God." Behold the Lamb of God. That this picture is a picture of something that's much bigger of what's happening in cosmic and salvation history. There would come a time when a lamb would be slaughtered so that you and I could have a household that's protected from the vengeance of eternal death by the blood of a lamb. It's a powerful picture. You see, you take his blood and apply it to the doorframes of your house, and it protects you from death. You know, the early apostles, when they were describing what Jesus' death was like, what it was all about, and what that death was for, the number one illustration that they used was the illustration of the Passover. You know, in our context, when we describe what Jesus' death is all about, we oftentimes will use the courtroom scene, right? Everybody is guilty. Jesus was innocent. Jesus takes the rap for us, and so therefore we can walk away as though we were innocent. And that's a great illustration from the Bible, but it's not the one the apostles would have used most often. They would have most often used the threat of the angel of death coming your way and the lamb that was sacrificed so that you might be free and rescued and clean. And so here's the question that you have to answer. Have you ever taken the blood of Jesus and put it around the door frames of your house? Not literally, metaphorically. Have you ever done that in your life? Because you see, for the people of Israel to be saved, it took an act of faith. They had to do that weird thing that God told them to do of putting blood around the door frames of their house. And I don't think it's because God couldn't tell who were Israelites and who were the Egyptians. God knew, but he wanted the people to go through an act of faith where they said, we trust in God enough to be able to do this thing because God told us to do that. And in so doing, we know that we'll be saved. And in our current context, God does the same thing for you and for me. He says, look, you exercise faith by trusting in Jesus and his death on the cross. You exercise faith through the blood that was shed on the cross of Calvary. And Jesus' blood was poured out like that innocent lamb. And your question is, will I take this for myself? Will I apply it to my own life? Well, the passage continues on in verses 31 to 36. It says this, during the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, and he said, up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship Yahweh as you have requested. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and just go. And also, bless me. That's an interesting thing for this passage. Feels a little bit anticlimactic, doesn't it? Like they've had this massive power struggle, huge dialogue for multiple chapters, and then Pharaoh just says, get out of here, go and worship, and by the way, will you bless me? Pharaoh wants them out of his hair at this point. He certainly had enough, but what is happening in this moment, don't miss the power of it. Because Pharaoh's actually admitting that Yahweh is bigger than the gods of Egypt. That I will submit to what Yahweh commands. That even I, thinking that I am the greatest God on the planet today, even I will submit to Yahweh And by doing this, it is a powerful moment in the balance of the gods of the universe. And he says, I just want you to get out of here. And it's not just Pharaoh who's sick of him by this point, it's everybody. So you see the reactions of the rest of the people in verse 33. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave their country. For otherwise, they said, we'll all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added, and they carried on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. And the Israelites did as Moses instructed, and they asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold, and for clothing. And Yahweh had made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and so they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. Isn't that a cool twist to the story? Where 1 minute you're slaves under the threat of potential death that's coming your direction, and the next minute, not only are you rescued, but you're walking away with all the silver and gold of the oppressors. Now, God predicted that this was going to happen chapters before, that they would, in fact, plunder the Egyptians, but now they, in fact, do that. The Egyptians have been in such despair from the plagues that they thought that maybe if they just give away their clothes and their gold and their silver, they would appease that God and make him very cooperative. So here's every Israelite, every man, woman, and child, not only leaving slavery, but carrying all the booty that they could possibly carry. Now, can you see the parallel in this as well? The parallel for our own spiritual lives? Because not only is it the case that God says, I'll forgive your past, I'll protect you from death, but he also gives you a load of treasure to carry that only God could bestow upon you. Your past is clean, your future is secure, you're guaranteed of a resurrection, you have purpose in life, you have hope, your life is now meaningful, you have a power source and a source of love that's unmatched anywhere in the universe. This is treasure from God, and this is good news, amen? This is what God has said to all of us. Carry this along with you. And with your freedom, you get all kinds of treasure in the mix. And friends, I want to invite you into this life. I want to invite you into the kind of life where there's forgiveness and hope and purpose and all of the riches of God. I want you to have it so bad. But the truth of the matter is, I can't grasp it for you. You have to exercise your own faith. You have to make your own decision. You have to come to this conclusion. But I can't imagine a reason why people would say no to this. I mean, the truth of the matter is, God knows your mess. He knows that there's some kind of soul dirt that's been in your life. And there's a lot of people who are a bit disturbed by this idea of the dirt in their lives when they come before God. I mean, maybe you're someone who says, I know the kinds of things I said to my spouse the other day, and it makes me feel dirty. Or maybe there's that really dark moment in your past that you'd like to forget, but every time it comes up, you know there's a mess on the inside. Maybe you use your words and your vocabulary to cut people down or in a way that's foul, and it just reminds you of how dirty your soul is. And some people say, hey, I want to go ahead and try and clean that up myself. Or maybe at least layer on top of it a bunch of nice things. And so they go on an obsession with niceness to prove to themselves or to prove to God that they're good enough for God. But the truth is, if you heap niceness on top of your soul dirt, there's still dirt there. It still needs to be cleansed. You need some kind of a spiritual Comet or Lysol to be able to clean that dirt up. That's what blood is in the Bible. That's what the blood of Jesus is. It's his spiritual Comet that comes in and cleans you up. And here's the deal, friends. You don't have to do it yourself. You don't have to be good enough. You don't have to be nice enough. You just have to say yes to God and let him do all the work. It's the greatest deal in the history of the universe. God goes to extreme lengths, sending his only son to pay for you, to pay for me, so that we can walk away with forgiveness in life. Friends, I want you to have that. Now, this is a really serious decision. And so I want you to take a few minutes to think about it, to contemplate on this one. If you're somebody who's not a follower of Jesus, consider the offer that God gives. And I'm going to have our artists come up here on the stage and give us a song and pictorial representation of what God does. That'll be a powerful moment. So think about that as you consider new life. If you're somebody who perhaps has already received Christ, you say, what do I do during this reflection time? Well, think on the goodness of God, that he would come and rescue your soul. He'd come into your life, and that his blood was shed for you and for me. And enjoy this moment as our artists come.